Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Masterclass series on emerging technologies, organized under the aegis of the India-Israel Forum and jointly convened by the Ananta Aspen Center, Confederation of Indian Industry, and the Tel Aviv University. This series is an initiative to promote the academic linkages between India and Israel by enhancing technical knowledge and awareness about the emerging technologies among college students in India. These masterclasses are possible thanks to the very generous support of Triveni Turbine Limited. Thank you all for joining us today. For the final masterclass of the second edition, we are delighted to have a very special speaker from Israel joining us today. A warm welcome to Dr. Erez Shmueli, who is a senior lecturer and head Big Data Lab, Department of Industrial Engineering, Tel Aviv University. Dr. Shmueli has an MSc and a PhD in Information Systems Engineering, and he has spent 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at MIIT Media Lab. He has also been a program and team lead in the Israeli Air Force and a project manager at Deutsche Telekom Laboratories at Ben Gurion University. He's also the co-founder of 2 startups, Barbiter and SafeMode. Dr. Shmueli's research interests include big data, complex networks, computational social science, among many other issues. It is a pleasure to have you with us from Israel, Professor. We are extremely eager to hear your talk. We will begin with a 40-minute talk by Dr. Shmueli and then move to the Q&A session. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin the session for the participants joining us today. Please keep sending in your questions for the session throughout using the Q&A function available at the bottom of your screen. Please do not wait until the end. We will be taking up the questions during the second half of the session. With that, I am now going to hand the floor over to you, Professor. Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm very delighted to be here. And let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you again for the invitation and for the long introduction and presentation of myself. As mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Tel Aviv University, but I also have strong relationships with the industry, co-founding several startups and consulting to several companies. Let me start this talk by talking a bit or giving a short overview to big data before I will dive into my own research in this field. And maybe the first question should be, what is big data at all? And before I answer this question in a certain way, let me start by providing 2 amusing definitions. So the first one is a definition given by Mike Pluta, an expert in this field, which talk about the Moore's law of big data. As engineers, I guess most of you know what is Moore's law, which basically predicted that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit is supposed to double itself every couple of years, roughly 2 years. And the idea here is that big data, the equivalence definition with regard to big data is that big data is a big buzzword, saying that the amount of nonsense packed into the term big data doubles itself approximately every 2 years, okay? Which is amusing, but is not far from being true. The second one is a definition, again, an amusing definition given by Professor Dan Ariely, a known behavioral economist, and he claimed that big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it, nobody really knows how to do it, everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone claims they are doing it. So again, no one knows what is big data, and everyone claims they are doing big data. If we go to a slightly more serious definition given by Wikipedia, we can say that big data is a collection of data sets so large and so complex in terms of the connections between the data parts that it becomes very difficult to process using standard or traditional means. And when I talk about traditional means, I mean a database system, relational database systems, which are with us for several centuries, but are not good enough to solve all of the problems we encounter with the amount of data and processing such data nowadays. If we go to a hardware point of view, so big data can be seen as a cluster. A cluster is typically a set of computers or servers which act independently. Each one of them has its own processor, CPU, memory, and so on, but they cooperate together to solve a bigger problem that each one of them cannot solve independently. And the last definition I will show here, and it's the one I connect most to, was given by Forrester Gardner, and it's called the 3 V's of big data, and it has an extension talking about the 4th V. I will explain it in the next slide. The 3 V's represent 3 dimensions of big data. So the first one is clearly the amount of data. Big data means a lot of data, of course, and the idea here is that if in the past most of the data we have was enterprise data generated by enterprises, nowadays maybe most of the data is user generated in mainly in online social platforms, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, Netflix, YouTube, and so on. And this data basically becomes a much portion of the generated data, much bigger than the one generated by enterprises. And if we look a bit to the future, it's predicted that most of the data will be generated using IoT, Internet of Things devices, which is basically every device that can connect to the internet in some way, starting from smartphones and smartwatches and smart lamps or smart cars, autonomous cars or smart cameras. And even we can talk about smart toilets or smart refrigerators. Everything that can connect to the internet can generate data, and this data is going to be huge. The second axis we can talk about is, or the second V, relates to velocity. How quick the data is generated and how quickly it should be processed. If in the past, when we would look at a newspaper and read an article, the article would describe something that happened yesterday. That was okay for, let's say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But now we expect to see everything very fast as soon as it happens. Try to consider a situation where you upload a post to Facebook and this post is being shown to other people only a day or 2 days after. That's not something we can actually be tolerated to. Okay, so the idea is that we want to process data very fast, and especially when we talk about large amounts of data. The third axis talks about data variety. The data we're dealing with is generated by many different sources. It could be, again, from smartphones, it could be from relational databases, from satellites, from other sensors, many different sources of data. That in a typical scenario, we will have to collect the data from all sources together and process them together. But not only that it comes from different sensors, it's also generated in different formats. It could be SQL tables, but it could also be unstructured. It could be text documents like web pages. It could contain photos, it contain videos, and many other different formats, which makes the handling of such data much more complex. The fourth V, which is not shown in this figure, is called veracity, which basically talks about the reliability of the data. In many cases, the data is collected in some kind of a biased way, biased selection. It can contain many missing values. It can even contain errors. And as opposed to what we have in the past with enterprise data stored in SQL systems, this situation is much more complex to handle. And that's another thing we should account for. So summing up this slide, and remember it when I describe my research later on, when we talk about big data, yes, the amount of data is important, but it's not the only thing that describes big data. The quickness, how quick we need to process this data, and the variety of sources we need to take care of, the richness of the data are also important aspects of this data. Okay, so we talked a bit about what big data is, but what can we do with it? Why is it so important? Why it has become such a big buzzword? So when I teach a course about big data in Tel Aviv University, I usually give this example. This is an example from Target, a well-known example, in which Target tried to improve its recommender system and send coupons to people according to their preferences. And this example talks about a person that enters a Target branch in the US and asks to talk with the manager. And when he meets the manager, he starts yelling and complaining to the manager that Target has sent coupons for baby clothes and cribs for his teenage daughter. The manager didn't know what to do with it exactly, but he started to say he's apologized and to be sorry about that. And then the person just left to his home. A few days after, the manager called this person and again apologized and asked for his forgiveness. But the person said that he actually talked with his daughter the day before, and he realized that his daughter is in fact pregnant. And so what I'm trying to convey using this story is that if we have a lot of data, historical data, and we have smart algorithms, machine learning algorithms, AI, deep learning, and so on, we can use these algorithms over the data to find hidden patterns that we wouldn't find otherwise. And in this case, those hidden patterns were the algorithm was able to predict or identify something that even the father of this teenage girl didn't know about her. Okay, so historical data and algorithms can provide us valuable insights and identify hidden patterns. So before we wrap up this overview section, let me talk a bit about business analytics, which I guess is very relevant to many of you, and talk about what is business analytics. So basically, let me read it. Basically, business analytics is the practice of iterate methodological exploration of an organization's data with emphasis on statistical analysis. So if we have an organization that has data, and if we explore this data in a methodic way using statistical analysis, that's exactly what business analytics is. And what does it give us? So business analytics usually is used to allow us to have better business decisions, and to allow us to automate and optimize different business processes. Organizations that we can call that have business analytics, organizations that are data-driven, relates to their data as the corporate assets. And clearly we know many such companies, for example, Google, Facebook, Amazon, so on. Data is their most valuable corporate asset. But not only, even other companies, for example, Intel, the chip manufacturer, which can be seen as a strict or mainly a hardware company. The CEO of Intel calls it a data company, and the reason is that Intel relates to data in a very important way. It acquired several companies that deal a lot with data. For example, Mobileye in recent years. It gives a lot of emphasis to data centers, and even a company like that can be seen as a data-driven company. If we talk about levels of analytics, most of the companies, roughly 80%, are still in this level of analytics. It's a growing levels, where those two levels include descriptive analytics, trying to understand what happened in the company, and in several cases trying to diagnose it and see why it happened. The more interesting parts of analytics are lying here, with predictive analytics, trying to predict what will happen, or trying to use existing data to predict unknown data. And prescriptive analytics, once we have such predictive model, we can start asking questions of what if we change something? What will happen? How can we make something happen? And companies that are in this stage of predictive analytics gain a lot of value from their data. Okay, so this was a short introduction to big data. Of course, I will be happy to answer questions later on. But let me dive a bit to what I do in my research. So I'm having the big data lab. I established the big data lab at Tel Aviv University. And again, I use the term big data, but what I mean by big data could be different for myself and for other researchers. So when I talk about big data, my main goal is to use or to try to understand better human behavior, using data to better understand human behavior. And if we talk about standards means of understanding human behaviors, we can talk about in the social sciences, we can talk about surveys, self-reported questionnaires, which is a valuable tool, but it has its, of course, its cons. For example, it's biased, it's self-reported, it's expensive, it's something you can do in a continuous manner, and so on. And in recent years, we were accustomed to see many studies by large companies, online companies like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, that analyze our online behavior, which again, they are doing great research with millions of people, but the main problem with this kind of research is that our online behavior is very different from what we do in our regular day-to-day life. And again, going back to my research deals with this box, trying to collect data about our real-world behavior. We all have smartphones or smartwatches or other means that contains quite a lot of sensors that can allow us to collect and understand better our behavior. And together with the development in recent years in machine learning, artificial intelligence, and social network analysis, analyzing this data is becoming almost a semi-automatic task, and we can gain quite a lot of insights out of it. The last part, which is very interesting and something I really like to do in my research, is how to make such environments in which we collect real data about individuals into what we call a living lab. Once we collect data from a real environment, we can also start doing manipulations, interventions, and make different changes in the behavior of people towards different goals we have in mind. And these three parts of sensing, understanding, and shaping human behavior is the main thing I'm focusing in my research, which again can be seen as a specific aspect of big data. But this field is also called, if you encounter the name, computational social science or social physics, or in the longer but less sexier name I use, sensing, understanding, and shaping social behavior. Before I continue with the specific study, this is my research group composed of postdocs, PhD students, master students, and so on. And I'll finish the introductory part here. So the rest of the presentation will be divided into two parts. The first and shorter part will give you a motivating example. What did I mean by sensing, understanding, and shaping human behavior? And the part after, we'll talk about the specific study we did. So with regard to the motivating example, I would like to give you to describe a project that we are working on right now, together with a colleague, Dr. Daniel Nin from my department. And this is a very ambitious project that was initially established a few years ago. And its main goal is to be able to allow us to detect or improve diagnosis of highly common infectious disease. But the idea behind here is to combine different sources of data that are usually not used today. So starting from electronic and medical records of the patients, together with behavioral information collected from their smartphones and smartwatches. And the idea is that this project contains two parts: a retrospective part that analyze data from their medical records, and the prospective part, which will entail 5,000 participants for a period of 2 years, and we'll follow them and collect all the data we can, of course, with their agreement and consent. So what kind of data we are going to collect, or we are already collecting several pilots. So first of all the participants are equipped with a mobile application that collects daily questionnaires regarding many aspects of their lives, starting with what their mood is, how stressed they are, the sleep quality in the last night, how much time they slept, how much sport they did, and different other aspects like social encounters, with how many people they met, and things that are more related to infectious disease, like where they diagnosed with certain disease and what are the symptoms they are experiencing. So all of those are basically self-reported questionnaires that will allow us to define the ground truth, the data we are trying to predict. And we will try to do it with data that is collected objectively from the smartphone itself, for example, the location of the person and the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and its screen activity over the phone, together with information collected from smartwatches that we equipped the participants with. Again, including objective measures of sleep, steps, activity, calories, heart rate, and so on. So let me give you several examples of what we did. This is, by the way, the mobile app itself. It's in Hebrew, so you cannot see it, but it contains information about symptoms, sleep hours, mood, and so on. And let me give you some results, preliminary results of these very ambitious projects. All of those are examples from papers that were submitted for review but were not published yet. So the first one talks about the second lockdown in Israel, the second COVID-19 lockdown in Israel. And what we did, we tried to look at participants and see if, using the information we have, we can provide some quantitative analysis of the effects of the lockdown. And we saw several very interesting issues. For example, we saw that most participants during the lockdown, their mood was lower, they slept more, they performed less sports activities, they met less with people, of course, it's a lockdown. We even noticed changes in their heart rate, in their step counts from the smartwatch, in their sleep duration from the smartwatch, and several other things. But maybe besides having a quantitative assessment of the lockdown effects, we also found very interesting differences between different subpopulations. For example, we saw that that younger people, which is interesting, the younger suffered more. Their mood levels went down more, and they did less physical activity significantly compared to older people. And this is interesting because most of the efforts, most of the emphasis is put towards trying not to hurt older people during the lockdowns. Another interesting thing we saw here is that while men became less stressed during the lockdowns, women became considerably more stressed during the lockdown. And also that women met considerably less people during the lockdown than men. And again, giving us an emphasis on which subpopulation we need to support during lockdowns. This is another example of a study in which we use the electronic medical records for early detection of COVID-19. So if you think about it, the main way to know or to assess whether a person is currently infected with COVID-19 is basically based on maybe measuring temperature and asking several symptoms like whether it's coughing or not. And what we show here is that we can predict with a very high accuracy, with 80% AUC, whether a person which has done a COVID test, whether it's going to be found positive or not, without even looking at those symptoms, just by looking at his socio-demographic information, of course, being found in neighborhoods that have a higher rate of positivity will make him more likely to be found positive, but also different behavioral aspects of his health consumption and health preventive behavior, like whether he vaccinated for flu last year will tell us with a good accuracy whether he's going to be found positive. So, and this is information we can see for those people even before they go to be tested for a test, and we can know with high accuracy whether they are going to be found positive in early stages, which is very important for cutting the infection change. And the last one is a very recent study we worked on. We actually measured different physiological measures for people who vaccinated with the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine in Israel. As you know, roughly 80% of the people that were eligible to vaccinate in Israel are already vaccinated. This was a very quick move in Israel. And what we see there is that if we look at different physiological measures, not self-reported, which is the common thing that is done in clinical trials, we see that in the first 48 hours after vaccination, all the markups change considerably compared to the baseline. The baseline is 0, and you see a great increase in all measures. You see here only 2, but we have 13 different. This is, for example, heart rate and temperature, body temperature, and you see an increase during the first 48 hours. But everything goes back to normal in the third day after vaccination. Another interesting thing that we saw here is that even people that do not report any symptom, that means asymptomatic people, which is roughly half of the people that took vaccination, we do see considerable changes in their physiological measures. So even though they didn't report any symptom, we still see differences. And that can be very interesting to think about how what changes should be made to clinical trials of vaccination, especially when such trials should be executed very fastly. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now I'll dive into the main research I wanted to show in this talk. I will go over it very quickly, of course, and try to finish it within 15 or 20 minutes. And this study was published in Ubicon 2018, and it talks about using monitoring incentives. We move to different domains for transportation and see whether monitoring incentives can be used to improve the driving behavior of professional drivers. And I really like this specific research because it emphasizes all the 3 points we talked about of sensing, collecting the data, understanding it, analyzing it, and changing, trying to change human behavior in some way. So let me start with the background for this specific study. So I guess most of you know that human factors contribute to 95% of all road accidents. So road accidents are not caused by malfunctions in the cars or something else. They are mostly caused by human factors, and professional drivers are 2 times more likely to be involved in car accidents, even after controlling for the time they spend on the roads. So improving the behavior of professional drivers can make a great difference in road safety. Traditional means like advertisements and educational sessions were found to be not very effective in changing their behavior, whereas more technological measures like offline and online feedback, for example, online feedback in the car is like if you get close to the car in front of you, the car starts to beep. And if you turn a lane without winking, it will beep again. This is online feedback. Offline feedback can be regarded as reports that are produced by the organization and given to the employees to show them how bad or how good they drove during the past, I don't know, 6 months or a year. Such feedback the 2 types were found to be effective, but what was found to be more effective is using monetary incentives to pay, for example, people or drivers for improving their behavior. But those were done in very specific settings, very limited experiments. What we wanted to do in this study is to see, of course, first, whether monetary incentives can improve the driving behavior of professional drivers. And again, it's not trivial because a driver that drives, let's say, for 30 years, it's not sure, even if you pay him a certain amount of money, it's not clear that he will change his driving behavior. And the second thing, which was not done before, we wanted to check different monetary incentive schemes. I'll talk about it in elaboration later. And the third thing is when we start using or paying money, we need to see that we have a sustainable environment to pay this amount of money. This money needs to come from somewhere. And the question is how. And we wanted to check whether monetary incentives can be used as a sustainable mechanism. So what we did is we conducted a study, a field study or a living lab with Metropoline, which is the 3rd largest bus company in Israel. And we did it over 2 bus lines with 60 drivers for a period of several months, starting with the baseline period, which we just collected data, then an intervention period in which we did something to change their behavior, and a post-intervention analysis. Where does the data come from? So professional cars or vehicles are usually equipped with things called IVDR, in-vehicle driving recorder system. And such systems were found to be very useful to improve the maintenance of cars, to know where each driver is at each point in time and so on. But they are also used to get some insight about the driving behavior of drivers. And the nice thing about those devices is that they contain multiple sensors and they collect information in a very objective and concise manner over time. And what they usually do is that they create driving alerts. Some of them are shown to the drivers, but some of them are just collected in the system. So if we can think about such a device that contains, for example, GPS and accelerometers and connected to the bus channel of the car, it collects a lot of pro data, but at the end, it will generate events such as whether the driver has pressed the brake pedal too harsh, or whether it turned the lane without or too strictly, and whether it got closer to the car in front of him too much, and so on. Those are the alerts we will be interested in. And we have this information collected in the database, so that was collected in online and in real time. And what we did, we took the drivers and divided them into 3 different groups. The first one was a controlled group in which we only collected the information. We didn't do anything else. The second group, the individual incentive group, what we did with them was to pay individuals a certain amount of money if they improved compared to the baseline period. And for the period world driver, we did something very interesting. Instead of paying the drivers directly for their efforts and their improvements, what we did is we let each driver choose another driver as a mentor. And what we did, we instead of paying the driver for his own improvement, we paid the mentor. So what we did, we created some kind of social pressure. Since the mentor wanted to be rewarded, he should have spoken with the driver itself to make him drive better. And this is a scheme we tried in other experiments and we found very useful. In fact, it was found to be 4 times better than just paying the person for his own improvement. So just to summarize what happened here, we have the IVDRS devices that collects alerts logs. In the first 2 months before the experiment, we created the baseline score. We used the data to create the baseline driving score for the driver. And for each day during the intervention period, we created a specific score for that day. And then we compared the daily score to the baseline score. If we found an improvement, the driver was paid, either receiving its own payment in the individual group or paying to the driver's mentor if the driver was assigned to the peer reward group. I'll skip this slide, it just describes better the calculation we did. And I'll just say that drivers were paid more or less, the amount of money we spent was 16 shekels, New Israeli shekels per day, which was around 4.5% of their salary for a certain month, okay? I'll skip also those details, it's less interesting. I didn't say, but drivers were equipped with a dedicated mobile application in which they could see how much money they gained, they could see the trips they've made and how well they behave in each trip, and dive into different levels of information about their driving behavior. And for the less technological drivers, we also sent the text messages to their phone summarizing the daily information. Finally, we also did use the different self-reported surveys asking for different information from the drivers. First of all, whether they were looking at the feedback they received, the text messages and the mobile phone application. We asked them how engaged and satisfied were they from the experiment. And for the peer reward group, we also asked different questions about the social interactions. So what is the uniqueness of our study? First of all, we work with professional drivers rather than a specific group of drivers. We used off-the-shelf data collection units and we didn't create a dedicated device. We used the devices already installed in the vehicles. We compared 2 different monitoring incentive schemes, the individual and peer reward. And we also tested at the end the improvement on fuel consumption, which can be seen as a certain way to look at sustainability of the system. So going very quickly over the results. Okay, checking before the results. We were quite hesitant whether drivers will cooperate. But in fact, drivers were very happy with this experiment. You can see here a driver that earned the largest monthly amount of money. He was very happy, but not only him, also other drivers were very happy. This is the master student Shuki that worked on this project with me. But in fact, they were so engaged that at some point they actually hacked into our system, trying to see how much money other drivers were making. So again, just saying, those were not technological people. Those were mostly bus drivers, but still, but they were so engaged that they made a great effort in trying to understand how much money other people are making, and they actually managed to hack our system and see that information. That in some point, when we understood it, we blocked it and we fixed the bug we had. So going to the main results. What you see here is the timeline. The blue represents the baseline period before we use our system, and the green one talks about the intervention period. And this is average overall driver, and you basically see an improvement of 25% in the number of events generated per hour per driver. So if the starting point was around 3.5, it reached around 2.5, 2.7. Interestingly, you cannot say that it was a seasonal effect, let's say summer, winter, holidays, and so on, because the control group did not have any change at all. Okay, so that was the importance of having a control group like in each lab experiment program. But this was done in a real environment. We also did other types of analysis just to make sure that the improvement was not caused by a specific individual. So what you see is that the improvement was behaved quite like a normal distribution, and the entire distribution shifted with the improvement. So it was not a specific drivers. We also did other analysis. I will not dive into this information. Another interesting point we saw here is that we saw a clear connection between using the mobile app that we provided and improvement. So in general, what we see is a correlation. People that use the app more tended to have higher improvement levels, but we cannot say any causality relationship here. We cannot say that using the app causes you to improve, because it could be the opposite way around, that people that are more engaged and improve more find themselves also using the app. So the connection is not clear, but we still see a correlation, a clear correlation, which is interesting. Again, surprisingly, what we saw is that if we compare the individual and the peer reward group, I told you before that the peer reward group was found to be 4 times better in other experiments we made. In this case, it didn't. So in the individual group had an improvement of 31%, and the peer reward only 15%. We were quite surprised to understand why it happened. And in order to answer those questions, we turned to see our self-reported questionnaires. Remember, at the middle of the experiments, and at the end, we had those questionnaires. And again, we asked different aspects of the experiments. First of all, did they use the app on their phone? So you see that in the individual group, 18 out of 19 actually used the app, whereas in the peer reward group, only 9 out of the 14 used the app. So you see here different aspects and differences between the two groups. But in general, most of the drivers used the app, were very engaged with the experiments, made very high effort to improve, believed in the potential of this experiment to make driver improve, and so on. But again, going back to the specific difference between individual and peer reward group, we saw that 35% of the drivers didn't even remember the name of their mentors. And if they didn't remember the name of the mentors, they couldn't actually communicate. And the social pressure we expected to happen didn't really happen, which could explain why the social pressure group, the peer reward, didn't work as well. I'll skip those slides. The last thing I want to show you before I summarize is that we also saw that an improvement in driving behavior was very correlated with a reduction in fuel consumption. It was so correlated that basically what we found is that that on average, drivers that participated in the experimental group were able to save, just by fuel consumption, more or less 10 shekels per day, which is 2/3 of the money we've paid him just by saving fuel. If you take into account insurance costs and maintenance costs and other things as well that are reduced by improving driver behavior, we clearly can gain quite a lot of money and have safer roads at the same time. So to summarize, again, monetary incentives are effective to improve driving behavior. We checked different monetary incentive schemes and found that the individual, the simple one, proved to be better. And clearly, the safer driving has the effect, a side effect of reducing fuel consumption, which makes it more sustainable. There are different aspects that we want to investigate in future work, but just to say one more sentence about the study, what we saw is that we exemplified all the 3 stages of sensing, understanding, and shaping driving behavior, starting from the devices that are installed in the car that collects information, analyzing it, and trying to understand the behavior of drivers. And lastly, use this information, the models we created, to change the behavior of drivers. And that's my specific perspective or view in my research about big data analytics. So thank you, and we can turn to questions now.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that extremely interesting talk. I'm sure the students have thoroughly enjoyed themselves, and they've sent in a few questions for you. So since we're going live on Facebook, we've received questions from there as well. So I'll pose a question to you, and would you like to take them one by one? Will that work?
Yes.
All right, great. So I'll start with the first question that has come in. Considering the fact that the exact nature and delineation of big data is still unclear and it continues to have an enormous impact on our daily lives, but there are also inherent risks to big data applications as it might result in discrimination, privacy violations, and other chilling effects. Would like to know what could be the possible framework to mitigate such risks.
Okay, so first of all, this is a very good question. In fact, I didn't touch it upon my slides, but great amount of my works or studies are dealing with such aspects, ethical questions, whether concerned with privacy or fairness of AI algorithms. And to tell you the truth, we are just starting to have such measures being used and understood better. So if we start with privacy, basically, if you use data, personal data of individuals, you encounter privacy issues. And the question is, what can you do? So several solutions were suggested in academia. I'm not going to touch on them, but what you see is the academic research together with the problem creates also a lot of legislations. For example, in Europe, you probably heard about the GDPR and the data privacy protection protocols that are very strict and try to protect the privacy of people. So for example, the first thing is that they are claiming that the data, even if collected by commercial companies, belongs to the person. And the person has the right to ask to be forgotten, to ask to delete his data, to ask to see what was collected about him. And he needs to provide his consent to be used using this data. So this is one example. The other one, for example, with regard to fairness, yes, of course, we have algorithms, and when we talk about algorithms, we expect algorithms to be less biased than people. But that's a difficult thing to say because those algorithms are learned using historical data. And if we have biases in the data, we will also have biases in the algorithms. So again, many studies are suggesting ways to handle such algorithms. And there is some kind of legislation about it, but I think that all those ethical questions will be dealt with in the future century. We'll see what happens with them.
Thank you, sir. The next question says, could you please give your views on the nexus between big data and IoT?
Again, sorry, next what, sorry?
Could you please give your views on the nexus between big data and Internet of Things?
Yes, I can say a few things. So first of all, I think that data is here to stay. We also experience the digital world in the recent period caused by the acceleration in the digitization due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I expect data collected from all means to be used in very different other domains. I showed you examples of medicine and transportation, but I also experience and I'm seeing go to other fields, whether it's agriculture or finance or even urban planning and everything, every field you can think of. So the collection, the large collection of data that is will be allowed using Internet of Things. And again, Internet of Things is a wide concept to describe everything that is connected to the Internet, will allow us to gain more data about our daily behavior. And if we have this data, we can predict, we can change, we can make a better world. But in the same step, we also need to be careful and make sure the data is being used for good purposes rather than for bad purposes.
Thank you. The next question is, can we correlate cloud computing and big data in analyzing human behavior, as both concepts have been used in several countries with production processes as an engine of economic growth?
Yes, again, this is a good question. As I explained, the field I'm investigating, which deals with mainly with human behavior, is an expanding field. It already, in terms of academia, it already generated multiple journals to be published in, and you can see multiple conferences that deal with it. And of course, it's going to be a hot topic for the next years. It actually changed the way social science research is being done. I'm not sure that all social scientists still understand it, but I'm sure that this discipline is going to change significantly. And you see it in many different countries and organizations. I expect it to be here with us and to develop very fast.
So it seems we're just starting with the disruption, lots more to come in. Coming to the next question from Facebook, what are the other incentives other than monetary incentives that could be used to improve the behavior of drivers?
Okay. So first of all, thank you. That's a great question. Since the presentation was very short and not interactive, I couldn't touch upon this point. Monetary incentives are only one means, and this is a clear mean. Of course, we expect if we pay someone, we will make some change in behavior. We will make him do what we want. But monetary incentives also have the con of when you stop paying money, you stop seeing this behavior. So if you want to create a more long-term effect, mechanisms that were found, for example, much better are related to social pressure. For example, if my wife is going to tell me all the time, be careful when you're driving, you have a family and so on, that will probably make me change my behavior for the longer term. Surprisingly, when we try to use such kinds of incentives using in the experiment, they didn't work so well. And the reason is not that those incentives are not so good. They are still good. I still believe in them very deeply. The main reason that, from my experience, they didn't work is that drivers were not connected very much. They didn't have time to spend with other drivers. They didn't have time to create friendship relationships with other drivers. And that's the reason it didn't really happen. So social incentives, peer pressure incentives are very important. You can think about other ways as well. Some that works better and some that works worse. For example, you can think about competitions. Okay, You can think about maybe giving coupons, not exactly money. You can think about just saying a good word to the driver and giving a certificate that he drove very well. All of those are possible incentives, but each one of them should be investigated separately in an experiment or academic experiment.
Right. There's a rather very honest question from one of the students here. He says, how can one get started in big data and what are the prerequisites?
Excellent. So first of all, you can come to Tel Aviv University and take and study. And maybe one word about it as a trend. We're starting next year we're going to provide a BSc, a first degree in a field called data science, okay? Which is, again, very related to big data and data science. We also have a program for master students, but Tel Aviv is not unique in this term. You can find it in all universities. So if you think about a long-term investment in studying those issues, I would definitely recommend studying these fields in university. Putting it aside, you can also find different courses, specific courses or a bunch of courses in online platforms like, for example, Coursera or others. But the first thing I would suggest to do, if again you think about something very short, start taking some courses at online platforms. If you think about the longer term and to invest more efforts in it, definitely I would suggest studying something similar in the academia.
Your presentation has generated a lot of curiosity among the students. So there are these three questions related to the driver skills part. So I'm going to start with the first question. What all parameters did you use to measure the individual's driving skills? And what kind of data what was the kind of data collected to decide the driver's incentives?
Okay. So again, like every study in the university, it was a very specific driver. I would say as a remark that we try to commercialize this idea into a company that clearly does many other things as well. But what we did specifically in this experiment, we used a specific in-vehicle data recorder system. The specific device that belongs to a company called Trafiog knows how to, it uses basically GPS information and accelerometer data. This is the raw data, and this data translates into 5 different types of events. So the first one is sharp brakes. If the driver brakes the car very sharply. The second is sharp turns, where they turn or make a round very fast. The third one is a speeding event, accelerating events. And I don't remember the fifth, but those were the main 5 events we used in different severity levels. We use this information to create a model that allowed us to say how safely the driver is driving. And after we had such a model, which creates a driving score for the driver, we could start talking about trying to improve the behavior of drivers. Okay, I hope this answered the question.
I hope everyone's taking note of all the answers that you've been raising, and you've got such detailed answers coming in. One last question, Professor, because we're almost at the end of the session. What are the challenges that you faced while collecting and analyzing data related to drivers?
Great question. So the first one, let me give you a very simplistic example, but again, a very complicated one. We have devices installed in the car. They collect data, okay? Which is great. It saves us all the trouble, all the hassle of installing our own devices for the experiment. We already have the data. But one issue is that the data is correlated with the car. The device doesn't know who is driving the car. Okay, so in order to correlate the information that we collected from the car to the driver itself, we had to do some operation. In that case, what we did, we connected to another system that collects information about shifts, working shifts of drivers, that tell us in what hours a driver drove and on which vehicles. So this very specific way of connecting the data from the devices to the drivers required us to merge data from different sources. Okay, clearly this has technological solutions, but we didn't want to invest in hardware and changing the way driver works. So again, organizing the data, cleaning it, removing outliers, filling missing data. All this pre-processing of data takes quite a lot of time. And in general, in big data studies, big data products, it's usually the largest step in the way, the largest bottleneck and step that requires most of the effort. Once we're through this stage, of course, there are other like the learning, applying machine learning and so on, but probably the longest part is doing this pre-processing of organizing the data.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a wonderful talk. You basically broke down such a complicated subject into such simple terms for the students. And we are also thankful to you for doing that. And I would like to thank all those who have joined us today for this fabulous presentation. And we hope to be back with another edition soon. So thank you everyone once again and have a great day ahead. All right.
You too, thank you. I was very happy to be here. Thank you.